On October 17th, 1975, a New York City official picked up the phone to call the White House and ask for a loan. Not for a new subway line, not for a bridge, for payroll. The city that built the tallest towers on Earth, that had bankrolled 2 world wars, that minted more millionaires than any place in human history, could not make its own paycheck. The federal government's answer, printed the next morning on the front page of the Daily News, was 3 words: Forward to City, drop dead. New York didn't drop dead, but it came close enough that the scar never fully healed, and the way it almost died and the way it clawed its way back created the exact conditions for the crisis the city is living through right now. This isn't a story about one bad decade, it's a story about a city that has nearly destroyed itself twice in 2 completely different ways and might be building the conditions for a third. To understand how a city with the largest economy in the country nearly went bankrupt, you have to understand a trick New York pulled on itself for almost 20 years. Starting in the late 1950s, the city started borrowing to pay for things that weren't investments, not bridges, not schools, but the everyday cost of running the place: salaries, pensions, debt service on old debt. It's the financial equivalent of paying your credit card bill with a second credit card. And city comptrollers did it for 2 decades because the moment they stopped, the entire structure would be visible. By 1975, the trick stopped working. The banks that had quietly financed this shell game for years simply refused to buy the city's bonds anymore. Overnight, a metropolis of 8 million people had no way to pay its own workers. What happened next is the part most retellings skip, because it's not a story about collapse, it's a story about the medicine being almost as dangerous as the disease. To avoid bankruptcy, the city accepted an outside financial control board with the power to override the mayor. Municipal unions, facing the loss of everything, poured their own pension funds into city bonds just to keep the lights on. A bet that, if it had gone wrong, would have wiped out the retirement of half the city's workforce in a single afternoon. To hit the numbers the banks demanded, the city fired roughly 60,000 municipal workers in under 2 years. Fire companies closed. Police headcount shrank. Subway maintenance, already deferred for a decade, was deferred further. And here's the part that made the 1970s crisis different from every other city's decline. New York didn't lose population because people were pushed out by policy first. It lost population because the basic function of urban life, someone answering when you call 911, someone fixing the third rail, someone collecting the trash, quietly stopped being guaranteed. Between 1970 and 1980, the city lost over 800,000 residents, roughly 1 in 10 New Yorkers, gone in a single decade. The subway system, starved of maintenance money, became so unreliable that by 1981 a train was more likely to break down mid-route than complete its trip without incident. Graffiti covered every car in the fleet, not as an art movement, but as a visible symptom of a transit agency that had stopped being able to clean, let alone repair, its own equipment. Behind the numbers was a specific kind of institutional denial. City comptrollers had been warned in internal memos years before the crisis broke publicly that the borrowing pattern was mathematically unsustainable. Those warnings were filed, not acted on, because acting on them would have meant admitting to voters that the city they thought was thriving was, underneath the surface, running on borrowed time in the most literal sense possible. By the time the banks refused to keep buying the bonds, there was no gradual off-ramp left, only a cliff. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because the thing that eventually saved New York financially is the same thing that's strangling it today. Facing collapse, city and state leaders made a calculated bet. Instead of rebuilding the industrial and middle-class job base the city had been steadily losing since the 1950s, they would re-engineer New York around one industry that could generate enormous tax revenue from a small number of very high earners: finance. Zoning was rewritten to favor commercial towers. Tax abatements were handed out for luxury development. Wall Street, already powerful, was given every incentive imaginable to become the actual foundation of the city's economy. It worked spectacularly. By the mid-1990s, New York's finances had stabilized. Crime, driven down by policing changes and a fading crack epidemic, fell faster than in almost any other American city. Times Square, a symbol of the city's 1970s rot, was redeveloped into a corporate tourist engine. The city didn't just recover, it became, again, the most desirable real estate market on the planet. But a city that rebuilds itself around finance and real estate instead of a broad job base makes a permanent trade. It solves its bankruptcy problem by creating a housing problem that never goes away. Once land is the city's most valuable export, every incentive in the system points toward building for the buyer who can pay the most, not the resident who's lived there the longest. There's a fourth factor rarely discussed alongside the finance pivot: The city's own emergency era, austerity, became permanent policy long after the emergency ended. Programs cut in 1975 as short-term survival measures, reduced transit subsidies, shrunk public hospital budgets, deferred infrastructure maintenance, were never fully restored, even once the city's finances recovered in the 1990s and 2000s, because restoring them meant reopening budget lines that had quietly become politically easier to leave closed. A crisis-era sacrifice became a permanent baseline, and an entire generation of New Yorkers grew up with a smaller, leaner version of public services than the city could actually afford to provide once it was thriving again. Look at what that trade actually did to the ground beneath people's feet. In 1975, when the city nearly went bankrupt, the median Manhattan apartment cost roughly 3 times the median resident's annual income. By the early 2060s, that ratio had exploded to more than 15 times income in many neighborhoods. Not because incomes collapsed, but because an entire global class of buyers, many of whom never planned to live in the apartment at all, began treating New York real estate as a savings account. Entire buildings in Midtown have units that sit dark for 11 months a year, owned by people who visit once, if at all, housing built, financed, and sold that no one actually lives in, while the city simultaneously has one of the largest unsheltered homeless populations of any American city. Rent-stabilized apartments, meant to be the one protection against this dynamic, became their own battlefield. Landlords, unable to raise rents on stabilized units fast enough to cover repairs, in some documented cases, simply let those units fall apart rather than fix them, warehousing habitable apartments as functionally vacant because an empty, deteriorating unit was worth more to them on paper than an occupied, rent-capped one. By 2023, city surveys counted tens of thousands of apartments sitting vacant for this exact reason, in a city where the waiting list for public housing runs into the hundreds of thousands of names. And the subway, the system nearly destroyed by the 1970s fiscal collapse and rebuilt at enormous cost through the 1980s and 90s, is now buckling under a different kind of neglect. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority carries such a mountain of debt from decades of construction, financed through borrowing rather than taxation, that in some recent years, more of every fair dollar went to paying interest on old debt than to actual train operations. The city solved its 1970s debt crisis by pushing debt 20, 30, 40 years down the line, and that bill is now due on infrastructure millions of people ride every single day. Consider a single, ordinary rent-stabilized building in a neighborhood like Bushwick or Washington Heights. In the 1970s, a building like it might have been abandoned outright by a landlord, unwilling to pay property taxes on a structure generating almost no rental income. One of roughly 100,000 housing units the city itself ended up seizing for unpaid taxes during the crisis years, becoming, almost by accident, one of the largest landlords in America. 50 years later, a nearly identical building in the same neighborhood might be owned by an investment fund that bought it specifically because rent-stabilized housing, purchased at the right price, generates a predictable, government-protected income stream, a complete reversal in who wants to own distressed New York housing and why, but one that still leaves the actual tenant with almost no power over the condition of the apartment they live in. The result is a city that looks, by every conventional measure, like the wealthiest place in American history, and is simultaneously one of the most expensive places on earth to simply exist in. New York's income inequality now rivals cities in the developing world more than it resembles other major U.S. metros. The top 1% of earners in Manhattan take home a share of total income comparable to some of the most unequal nations on the planet, while the city's poverty rate has remained stubbornly stuck near 1 in 5 residents for decades. Small businesses, the storefronts that once defined entire blocks of the city's character, have been squeezed by the same commercial real estate logic that inflated apartment prices. Landlords holding out for a high-paying national chain rather than renegotiating with a struggling independent tenant, even if it means the storefront sits empty for years. Walk certain stretches of Manhattan today, and you'll find retail vacancy rates that would have been unthinkable at the height of the 1970s crisis, except this time the buildings aren't empty because the city is dying. They're empty because the city is, on paper, too valuable to rent cheaply. The same logic has reshaped the city's relationship with its own workforce. Teachers, police officers, sanitation workers, and nurses, the exact municipal employees whose mass layoffs defined the 1970s crisis, increasingly cannot afford to live in the city that employs them. Commuting in from Long Island, New Jersey, and upstate counties because the wages a city government can sustainably pay no longer come close to matching the cost of the real estate that same government's finance first recovery strategy helped inflate. A city literally cannot staff its own emergency rooms, precincts, and classrooms with people who live nearby because nearby became unaffordable for the workers whose job it is to keep the city running. New York matters because it proves something uncomfortable. A city can solve the crisis that nearly killed it, and in solving it, plant the seed of the crisis that's slowly hollowing it out now. The 1970s taught city leaders that a diversified, broad-based local economy was too slow and too politically messy to save a sinking ship. The finance and real estate rescue was faster, and it worked. But it built a city whose fortunes are tied almost entirely to global capital flows, a city government has almost no control over, meaning the next shock, whenever it comes, will hit a city with far less flexibility to respond than it had in 1975, because there's no cheap Times Square left to redevelop, no crumbling subway fleet still ahead of it, no obvious lever left to pull. It also matters because New York is, in this specific sense, a preview rather than an exception. Other global cities that leaned on finance, tourism, or high-end real estate to escape their own fiscal crises, London, San Francisco, Vancouver, Hong Kong among them, show strikingly similar symptoms. Soaring housing costs disconnected from local wages, empty investment-grade apartments, hollowed-out middle-class populations pushed further from city centers. New York isn't a strange outlier city that mismanaged its recovery. It's the first, largest, and most studied version of a rescue strategy dozens of other cities have since copied, consciously or not, complete with the same side effects arriving on a similar delay. There are real efforts underway to break the cycle. Congestion pricing, finally implemented in Manhattan after decades of political fights, is designed to fund transit repair through drivers rather than more borrowing. Zoning reforms in the mid-2020s began for the first time in generations to make it easier to build multifamily housing outside the traditional high-density core. A handful of neighborhoods from parts of Brooklyn to sections of the Bronx have become genuine case studies in mixed-income development that doesn't rely purely on luxury towers to pencil out. But the structural bet made 50 years ago, that a small number of extremely high earners could carry a city of 8 million people, has not been unmade. It's simply been managed, administration after administration, the same way debt was managed in the years before 1975, carefully, competently, and without ever actually resolving the thing that could, under different pressure, break again. Housing economists who study the city closely tend to agree on one point regardless of their politics: the supply of new housing. New York has permitted over the past 2 decades has consistently trailed the number of new jobs and households the city's finance-driven economy has generated, meaning even a successful decade of construction still leaves the city further behind on affordability than it started, simply because demand from a global pool of buyers grows faster than any politically achievable construction pace can match. Closing that gap, rather than managing it, would require a scale of zoning and political change that no administration since the 1970s has attempted. There's a particular irony in the fact that the very borough that symbolized the city's 1970s collapse became, decades later, ground zero for its affordability crisis. The Bronx, which lost so much housing stock to fire and abandonment in the 1970s that entire blocks were photographed from the air as rows of burned-out shells, is now one of the fastest gentrifying boroughs in the city. The same land that landlords once considered worthless enough to burn for insurance money is now valuable enough that longtime residents are being priced out by the exact kind of investment interest that would have been unthinkable 50 years ago. The city didn't just recover from its lowest point, it recovered so completely that the ground beneath its worst crisis became some of its most sought-after real estate, without ever meaningfully solving the underlying question of who that recovery was actually for. New York never dropped dead. The city that the federal government refused to bail out in 1975 rebuilt itself into the most valuable urban real estate on the planet, and it did so by making a trade nobody voted on directly: stability for the city's finances, purchased with permanent precarity for the people who actually live there. The skyline got taller, the trains eventually got fixed, but the apartment nobody can afford, the storefront nobody will rent cheap, and the transit system quietly drowning in old debt are not signs that the 1970s crisis is history. They're the bill for how New York chose to survive it. And 50 years later, the city is still paying it, one rent check at a time.